Here we go. Let's get started. Again, my apologies. Next week we'll try for same time, 8:30, but you won't be here, so we'll meet at Shul. Next week we'll meet at Shul at 8:30. Okay. Hopefully we'll be a little bit easier next week. Okay, let's go. We're on Chav Beis Amud Aleph at the top of the page. The last definition that we gave for a Rasha Arum, the very last definition that we gave for a Rasha Arum was someone who was Kara, Vishana, V'lo Shimesh Tamidei Chachamim. Kara means he read. Right. When we talk about reading, we're talking about learning Chumash. Right. We're not talking about a guy here who doesn't know. We're talking about somebody who was a person who studied Chumash. He studied Chumash. He was Koreh. He studied Chumash. Shana means what? Mishnah. He learned Mishnayos. Right? But he wasn't Mishamesh Tamidei Chachamim. He didn't do an internship with Tamidei Chachamim. He didn't tag along with the poskim to understand how they were thinking and what they were, how they were analyzing the various sugyos and the different opinions and things like that. And he is called a Rasha Arum. That's a lot different than the previous categories that we spoke about. Right? In all the previous categories, a Rasha Arum was sort of somebody who was doing something that might have been halachically permissible, but morally objectionable. I think that was Ron's turn, right? Morally objectionable. Here, we're talking about somebody who seems to be, on the up and up. Here's a guy who's learning, right? He's learning Chumash, right? He's being Ma'abir Sedra. He learns Chumash, right? Shnayim Mikra B'Echad Targim. He learns Chumash, and he is learning Mishnah. He knows Mishnah also, and we're not talking about somebody who's a dummy. He knows these things, but he's lo shimesh tamidei chachamim, meaning he's not learning the reasoning behind these things. Okay, so, all right. So, right. I was going to say, halavai, I should have a shul full of people who have learned Chumash and who learned Mishnah, right? Halavai, I'd be very happy, right? I'd be happy if everybody learned Gemara also, but okay, Baruch Hashem, be very happy. So what's going on here? So how come this guy who learns Chumash and learns Mishnah, but is not Mishamesh Tamidei Chachamim, he doesn't understand the underlying principles. He doesn't know how to apply what he's learned. Why is he called a Rasha Arum? Right? Why is he called a Rasha Arum?
Because he's doing this because, whatever, he can do so much.
Doing what?
I mean, he's only learning those two.
Oh, so it's a good question.
Or he's like,
and is he holding
or is he belligerent
like...
about,
All right, so Arnie's asking a very interesting question. Why did this guy only learn these things? Why did he only learn Chumash? Why did he only learn Mishnah? Right? In other words, is he saying like, I haven't gotten up to Gemara yet, right? No, right. That does not seem to be the implication of the Gemara. The implication of our Gemara seems to be that the guy makes a deliberate effort to avoid learning, to avoid being Mishamesh Tamidei Chachamim. When you hear the phrase Mishamesh Tamidei Chachamim, translate that as learning Gemara, meaning learning, not art scroll Gemara per se, but learning the reasoning behind things.
But he doesn't respect, the Chachamim.
So this is part of the reason why, as we're trying to understand, why is he called a Rasha Arum? What, halavai, what's wrong with such a guy? So what's wrong with such a guy is that he is portraying himself.
He holds himself out.
He holds himself out there, and he is portraying himself as someone who is knowledgeable. Right. He can quote psukim from Chumash.
Like the Rasha.
Right? He can quote psukim from Chumash, and he can also quote Mishnayos. Right. So the average person who hears him quoting Chumash and Mishnayos, what does the average person think? I can rely on this guy. I can go to this guy for psak halacha. I can rely on him. He knows what he's talking about. Except what? He doesn't know what he's talking about. Why doesn't he know what he's talking about? Because in order to know what you're talking about, you have to understand all of the details, all of the rationales, all of the explanations, all of the reasons why. And once you learn those, so then you can be a Talmid Chacham. Then you can hold yourself out to be a Talmid Chacham. He is a Rasha because he is choosing not to learn these reasons and rationales and things like explanations. He's choosing not to be Mishamesh Tamidei Chachamim. He's a Rasha. And he's Arum. Why? Because everybody thinks he's Everybody thinks he's great. Everybody thinks he's knowledgeable. So those two.
Was it the Sadducees, the Ducites?
The Sadducees.
The Sadducees.
Would this apply to the Sadducees? Now,
They were very literal.
Right. I don't know that the Sadducees.
Didn't learn.
In other words, the Sadducees rejected rabbinic Judaism. Right? The Sadducees said, we only go by what's in we don't hold that there's a Torah Shabbat Peh. In other words, the Sadducees were a whole different thing. So, in other words, if you were interacting with a guy who was a Sadducee, so you knew he was a Sadducee. There was you weren't thinking, oh, he's a Talmid Chacham. Or you know who you're dealing with. And it's interesting because clearly at one time we interacted with the Perushim and the Tzedukim, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They didn't get along, but they obviously interacted with each other. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes, right? There was clearly an overlap of communities and an interaction, but you knew who you were dealing with. The famous Mishnah that talks about what they used to do to the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim. What used to happen?
They used to cry. They used to talk.
Why?
Because they suspected him of being.
In other words, they would say to him, make sure you do the avoda. The other kohanim, right? The senior kohanim would say to him, make sure you do the avoda in this particular way. And the way they were describing was the rabbinic Judaism interpretation of the psukim. Right? Make sure, and don't do it like the Tzedukim. And then they would turn aside and cry, and he would turn aside and cry. They would cry because they suspected him of being a Tzeduki. He would cry because, but you know what? There were Kohanim Gedolim who were Tzedukim. Right? It was a whole different world. Right? Not like for us we think, but there were Kohanim Gedolim who were Tzedukim. And
they even continue to now. The Karaites are.
So that's we'll talk
Maybe
about
not modern day ones.
right.
but
We'll
from
talk about the
1,000 years ago.
Samaritans today, right? Are the Samaritans today connected to the Tzeduki
Or the Karaites.
or the Karaites? Yeah, the whole right. But basically, when was the last time you met a Samaritan? Right? Unless you're going to Har Grizim, right? Unless you're going to Har Grizim, you're generally not meeting anybody from the Samaritan community. There is a Samaritan community in Achinami, absolutely, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's come back to our Russia Arum, right? He's a Russia because he's deliberately not learning all of these explanations and guidelines and rationales and svaras and all of those things, and he's Arum because he's portraying himself as if he's competent and capable of giving halachic direction. That's why he's a Russia Arum. Okay, that was the last thing, right? That's the last definition of a Russia Arum. We're going to pick up now with this idea of a person who is Kara Vishana Veloshimesh Tamidei Chachamim. Right? The Amoraim do not have nice things to say about such a person. Okay, Rabbi Elazar Omer, Rabbi Elazar says, Harei za am haaretz. Rabbi Elazar says that a guy who is Kara Vishana Veloshimesh Tamidei Chachamim, a guy who learned Chumash and a guy who learned Mishnah, but a guy who never learned Gemara, never learned how to understand the Mishnah, never learned how to apply what he was learning, is paskening from Mishnah. You're not allowed to pasken from Mishnah. Right? He was paskening from Mishnah. He never bothered to learn the depths, to probe the depths and to understand the depths of halacha. Saharei ze am haaretz. What is he like? He's an am haaretz. What's an am haaretz?
An ignoramus.
Well, we translate it as an ignoramus. Right?
The nations of the world.
But ignoramus has a very negative connotation to it. More like, well, yes, it is a negative connotation.
You're not exactly calling him.
Right? It's not exactly giving him shlishi, right? I understand. But an am haaretz is really to be understood as a person of the land. In other words, he's a pashut person. It's a person of the land. He's a person who was an am haaretz was a person whose daily preoccupation was in making a living. Right, living off of the land, and not right. We can broaden the definition, right? Right. You know, a person who was not spending his time studying Torah. Right? That was so. And because of that, we believed him to be lax in certain things. So one of the areas in which we said an am haaretz was lax was in areas of tuma and tahara. Now, for us today, Tum and Tara don't really matter. In other words, they matter if you're a Kohen, Michael, right? And Michael, right? They matter if you're a Kohen, but other than that, that they're really not as relevant to us as they were in the days of the Beis Hamikdash. But in the days of the Beis Hamikdash, Tum and Tara were very relevant, and very complicated laws. And the average guy, the average person who would be referred to as an Am Haaretz was not somebody who was trusted that he had sufficient knowledge to be able to know what was Tameh and what was Tahor. And therefore, everything from the Am Haaretz was treated as Tameh. Additionally, the Am Haaretz was not thought to be particularly knowledgeable in the area of separating the agricultural gifts that he needed to separate and to give to the Kohen, give to the Levi, give to the Meiser Sheni, right, Meiser Ani, right? Also because it impacted on his livelihood, right? He's spending his whole day doing what? Spending his whole day, working the land to make a living. We're not so sure he's going to be distributing from his harvest exactly what he is supposed to be distributing. So we consider the produce of an Am Haaretz as produce that is not tithed, has not been tithed.
So what do we tithe it again?
Right, so we tithe it again, correct. We tithe it again. So that's the idea. This is the understanding of what an Am Haaretz is. Yes, it's a pejorative. It certainly has a negative connotation to it, but it's also possible to look at, also possible to learn and to say, we're talking here about a simple person, right? It's simple. It's just he lacks the knowledge. He's a simple person. But he lacks the knowledge. Okay. So that's Rabbi Lazar, right? That a person who's korev, is shona, but is not mishamesh tamidei chachamim is like an Am Haaretz. Why is he like an Am Haaretz? Because he's missing the knowledge, right? Just like the Am Haaretz is missing the knowledge of the laws of Tum and Tara, just like the Am Haaretz is missing the laws of Trumos and Maasros, so too this person who is korev, korav, v'shana, v'lo-shimesh tamidei chachamim, he's missing out on what? He's missing out on the deeper understanding of the laws that he's learning. It's sort of like I'm trying to think. Well, what is it comparable to? I don't know. I guess maybe it's like tax codes. I'm just thinking tax codes. Is there a thing like you have to understand the rationale behind?
I don't think badly of anybody who doesn't know tax codes.
No, I don't mean that. What I'm saying is there are probably people who paskin from
Tax cheats.
like I don't know how tax codes are written. I don't know how tax codes are written. Right?
People who write that.
Right? But maybe there are like they're Rashi Prakim. In other words, they're like headlines, right? And then there's the large print and then there's the small print. So you want an accountant who knows the small print also, not just the large print. But I'm sure there are accountants who just know the large print. I think it's in every profession. I'm sure there are lawyers, right, who know they might know how the case was resolved, but they don't know all the particulars of what was going on and the arguments back and forth. And certainly the more knowledge that you have, the more you're able to be helpful to your client, whatever it is. Okay, so this is the person who portrays himself as a Talmid Chacham, and just a fascinating insight, right? We would look at such a person. If you knew such a person, right, person who was learning Chumash, a person who was learning Mishnah, you might be tempted to call him a Talmid Chacham. All right, you might be tempted to say, you know what? In my book, he's a Talmid Chacham, but from the Gemara's perspective, he was anything but a Talmid Chacham, because he's missing right. Because he was missing the most important part, right? What was he? He was missing the most important part. What was he missing? He was missing the ability to transform it into real life. In other words, what he was learning was valuable, right? But he was missing the opportunity to transform it into real life, and yet he was portraying himself as someone who had that capability, and he was actually paskening incorrectly. Meforshim say this is what happened. He was paskening incorrectly. So he's, according to Rabbi Lazar, says, you know what he's like? He's like an Am Haaretz. Now remember, we had an opinion, Ula's opinion, who said he was a Rasha Arum. Right. So I guess this is a little bit better than a Rasha Arum, but he's an Am Haaretz. That's Rabbi Lazar. That's number one. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani says, Harei bor. He's a bor. What's a bor? A bor is the same thing in Hebrew and in English, right? Bor, bet vav resh, bor, B-O-O-R, right? What is a bor? It's a bore.
Dark is in a dark hole or a deep hole?
A bore is a
a
hole.
bore.
Correct. A bore is
Oh,
a hole.
that's-
Right.
but that's
Right. A
different.
bore is a hole. But when they use it as referring to an individual, they're referring to an individual who in English is a bore. Boor. You know, it's interesting. I wonder if there's any etymological connection, right? Between the two. It's a very interesting idea. A bore is an uncouth person, right? So what we're seeing here is actually right. We're going down the list.
He's
right?
getting worse.
He's getting worse.
My name is 2 lines down.
Right. He's getting worse. In other words, one opinion holds that he's an Am Haaretz. An Am Haaretz is somebody who has
Limited knowledge.
limited knowledge.
Right.
All right, limited, but he could still be a mensch.
Right.
But if he's a bore, what do we say about a bore? We say a bore is a person who's a prust individual. He doesn't have the knowledge and he doesn't even have the manners. He's uncouth.
What's the line between an Amma Aretz and an Ish Tam? Or Ish Tamim, you know?
Each time is more. It has in the same way that ignoramus had a negative connotation. Each time is an innocent.
It's a simpleton.
I mean, that's right. That's our connection from the Seder, right? From the Seder, we refer to the Tam. The Tam is the person who has an innocence to him. What?
You know, that Noah was Tamim in his time.
Oh, Tamim is different. Tam and Tamim are pretty much different. When Noah was referred to as
It
right
seems like a regular guy.
as a person who was Tamim, no, it means it was a positive.
That he was.
He was pure. He was wholesome. Right. He was pure. He was wholesome. Yaakov ish tam Yoshev ohalim doesn't mean that Yaakov was a simpleton. It doesn't mean that Yaakov was naive. Right. Yaakov was anything but he was an ish tam. He was pure and wholesome, and also learned. Right. So a bor is a person who not only doesn't have the learning, but he doesn't even have the midos. Right, that that an Am Haaretz. An Am Haaretz can at least have midos. Do you have anything for us?
It's like a slow connection.
Okay, all right, there you go. Okay. All right, you didn't pay your internet bill. Rabbi Yanai Amar, what does Rabbi Yanai say? Rabbi Yanai Omer Hareze Kusi. Right, so now we're getting worse, all right? We started out as an Am Haaretz, right? Then we went to a bor, now we're at a Kusi, right? Rabbi Yanai says he is a Kusi. Who were the Kusim? You have a whole explanation down here, right? Who were the Kusim? When anybody remember what's going on? You can read it quickly if you want to read it, right? Who were the Kusim? So if you remember,
That asked the question, where the king asked the question. Am I mixing?
that's
No,
the
that-
Kuzari.
That's
That's
Kuzari.
Kuzari. Kusi and Kuzari are two different things. All right. The Kusim were individuals who were brought in by Sanchariv to repopulate the northern kingdom, right? What happened was Israel has split, right? After Shlomo, Israel split into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, and as a result of that, this growing divide among the people, Sanchariv from Assyria came in, conquered the northern kingdom, and as was his practice, took all of the people and exiled them to different places. He was very smart.
Those are the lost.
Right? Why did he exile them to different places? Because if you all get exiled to the same place, so you retain a sense of community. But if you get exiled to different places, part of you goes over here, 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 what happens? You lose your sense of identity. Right? You lose your sense of identity. Interestingly, I'm not so sure if Hayas, familiar with the organization Hayas, responsible for resettling many
Syrian
Jews.
refugees.
Right?
That's a whole other
That's a whole other story. Many Jews here, if they didn't have the same svara. In other words, where did they set? Think about some of these places where they settled Jews. Right, they settled Jews in Texas. Right, they settled them in all. They don't all get settled in the Lower East Side. Right, settled them in different places, maybe in an effort to acculturate them to the society in which they were now going to be living. Could be, but so Sanchariv took the people, the 10 tribes, the northern, right, the northern Israel, and exiled them into Assyria. And you can't just leave the land barren. So he brought in, did a people swap, right? He brought in this group from Kus, right? The Kusim, and they populated that area. They weren't Jews. They were Kusim. But what happened? Kadosh Baruch Hu was not particularly happy that they had taken the place of his 10 tribes. These were the lost tribes, right? Ultimately, they became the lost tribes. So Kadosh Baruch Hu was not particularly happy about that. We read in Tanakh that Kadosh Baruch Hu sent lions to attack the Kusim. The Kusim got the message, and what did they do? They converted to become Jewish. But obviously their conversion to become Jewish was motivated by less than stellar reasons, right? Less than stellar reasons, right? They converted because they were afraid, right? Because the lions were attacking them. So they said, you know what? Maybe this is a message.
be a Jew.
Maybe this is a
By the
message.
lion.
Maybe we should be Jewish. And that's precisely what they decided to do, right? They decided to, in effect, become Jewish. But the rabbis understood that since their conversions were questionable, that they actually considered the wine of the Kusim to be prohibited and the bread of the Kusim to be prohibited. Now, you might be familiar with wine of Ovdei Avodah Zarah being prohibited, right? Why? Because
They use it for Avodah Zarah.
they use it for Avodah Zarah. We're not allowed to derive any benefit from anything that was used for Avodah Zarah. So the wine of Ovdei Avodah Zarah we were denied the use of it. We're not allowed to use the wine of Ovdei Avodah Zarah. Since some of the Kusim were still Ovdei Avodah Zarah, what did Chazal say? No wine of the Kusim. What about the bread of the Kusim? Right? Why is the bread of the Kusim prohibited? Well, is the bread right? What is Pas Yisrael? Anybody know what Pas Yisrael is?
Flour.
Jewish bread. Now, what is Pas Yisrael?
Oh, it's flour that has been
Flour.
watched from the time. that
No.
you've taken
You're
it off
thinking
of
about Shmura Matzah.
No,
But you take it
Right,
off
you're
of
thinking
the-
about
the
Shmura
piece
matzah.
that you take
Have to
it
be
off
set
the piece.
aside.
You
Pas
set aside pieces.
Pas Yisrael is bread that was baked by a Jew.
Right. And
Bread that was baked by a Jew, okay? As opposed to bread that was baked by a non-Jew, which is called Pas
Akum.
Akum. Pas
It's called
Akum,
Wonder
Akum
Bread.
is also
Wonder
common
bread.
into
Wonder bread.
negative,
right?
you know.
Pas Akum. And even though the word Akum means Ovdei Kochavim Umazolos, referring to people who are Oved Avodah Zarah, Akum took on historically a more generic meaning to actually denote non-Jew. So you have the bread of non-Jews and you have the bread of Jews, right? Bread of Jews is called Pas Yisrael. The bread of non-Jews is called Pas Akum. Do we eat Pas Akum?
Yes.
Nope.
No.
Nope.
What do you mean, no?
We have a
Nope.
sure, but
I mean, there's a hechsher on
Nope.
this stuff.
Nope.
Because you're saying they took challah.
Nope.
They take them do
Nope. We don't eat Pas Akum. We don't eat Pas Akum. Right? Right?
So what is one?
What do we eat? We eat what's called Pas Palter. What's Pas Palter? What's Palter? Anybody know? A baker. Right? Pas Akum means my next door neighbor baked that bread. My next door neighbor, the McCarthys, baked that bread. Okay? I can't eat that bread. Even if there was a mashkiach, right? Even if my wife went into the house and my wife watched, saw, checked everything that they did, right? Even if there was a mashkiach, I still can't eat that pas akum. Pas palter, on the other hand, bread baked by a non-Jewish baker, a non-Jewish bakery, a non-Jewish factory,
The professional.
that I can eat. Why? What's the prohibition of pas akum? Why is that? Why can't I eat my next door neighbor's bread? I know you're going to tell me it's not kosher. Let's assume all the ingredients are. Let's go back to the days when bread was made from flour and water. Everything was kosher, not a problem. Maybe
Because
cooked,
you're gonna have
maybe
bread
maybe
with
cooked it in an
technology.
oven with something trimmed. All right, let's go back to the days where bread was cooked all in a bread oven.
Avodah
Okay,
Zarah.
what? No, we didn't use bread for
they're
avodah
giving
zarah.
acknowledgement
but-
to their God, not to our God, for having it. Whereas a baker is saying, "I'm doing it for business." He's not
Oh,
doing it
interesting idea that they're gonna say grace after, grace
Right.
before they eat. Interesting idea. Not the reason though, but interesting
Because
idea.
you want to separate yourselves from the non-Jews. So you break
It's
bread.
because of chasanus. That's the reason it's called because of chasanus. What is chasnus? Chatanut, right? Marriages, chus, right? You know, however you want to say it, right? Chasanas, right?
This could lead to mixed dancing. is what
Because, well, yeah, could ultimately lead to mixed dancing. Right? But what are we talking about? We're talking about the reason I'm not allowed to eat my non-Jewish next door neighbor's bread is because I'm not supposed to socialize with my non-Jewish neighbor, because socializing might lead to socializing, which might lead to marriage, intermarriage. So I'm not allowed to eat the bread of my non-Jewish next door neighbor, even if I know the bread is kosher, it was baked fine, there was no problem, even if I know all those things, nevertheless, I'm not allowed to eat that bread. Why? But pas palter I can't eat the bread of a non-Jewish baker, because you're not socializing with the baker. It's a business. In other words, my neighbor, right, invites me over for a meal, gives me bread at the meal, so I feel a certain hakara satov, a certain, a gratitude to that person. We have this idea, you go to somebody's house for lunch. What are you looking in your calendar for? Okay, when am I going to invite that person to me? There's a certain sense of hakara satov, or a certain quid pro quo that's there. So that doesn't happen when you go to a baker. Why? Because you're paying money for it, right? You're buying. It's a business transaction. It's not a social interaction. You don't schmooze. I mean, maybe you schmooze with the little old lady behind the counter. She wraps up the cookies for you. She gives your kid a cookie, whatever it is. I still have very fond memories when I was a kid. My mother taking me to the local bakery and getting, I'm telling you, Mom, I could close my eyes and taste those cookies, right? To this day, I have a soft spot for bakery cookies.
It was my Aunt Basha's bakery too. So
Right. And I also have a soft spot for those ladies who could tie those boxes with that string, that big roll of string. That was it.
Strauss
Right?
was the last.
Right, that was right. Right, and they were amazing. They were amazing, and you couldn't get it off. Right, you could not get it off. Right, so a bakery, so it's a non-Jewish bakery. It's not a social interaction. It's a business transaction. So for a business transaction, the rabbis would not go there. The only time we are particular not to even eat pas palter, anybody know? Is there a time during the year when we are particular to eat only pas Yisrael? So the Shulchan Aruch says, Aseres Yemei Tshuva, right, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and based on you guys, that's tomorrow. Between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur during Aseres Yemei Tshuva, that is the time when we eat pas Yisrael. We try not to avail ourselves of any leniencies during that time, since HaKadosh Baruch Hu is judging us during that time. Try to not avail ourselves of any leniencies and we eat pas Yisrael. So pas, the bread of a kusi, also became forbidden. So what are we saying? So according to this opinion, a person who is kore, v'shana, v'lo shimesh tamidei chachamim, guess what? Can't drink his wine and can't eat his bread. Why a second? Why not?
Don't associate with them.
Right, why not? Right, he's a Jewish guy, right? Why? Right, he's a Jew, and he's learning Chumash, he's learning Mishnah. He's a Jew. I can't. Right, all right. The kusi I understand. Right, the kusi I understand. I can't drink his wine. I can't eat his bread. But so there are those mefarshim who say that nowhere in halacha are you going to find the prohibition of eating the bread and drinking the wine of a person who knows Chumash and Mishnah and doesn't know Gemara. You're not going to find that. It's just
eat anybody's house today.
What?
Nobody would be able to eat it anyway.
Right, it's just wait, people eat in other people's homes? Does that happen? Right, what is it? No, it's just an idea that the even though when the comparison is made to a kusi, it's not meant to be made from a halachic perspective, that just like a kusi, you can't drink his wine, you can't eat his bread. So to a person who's kara v'shana lo shimesh tamid chacham, can't drink his wine and can't eat his bread. No, that's not what the comparison is. Simply on a madrega, right? He's a right. So now we're going down, right? We're going down the scale, right? So either he's an am haaretz, or he's a bor, or he's a kusi. Now we get to the worst one. And what's the worst one?
Boer, by the way, is Middle German or Dutch. Like the Boers is one like B-O-E-R.
Yeah. Okay. No connection to the Hebrew. All right.
According to Merriam-Webster.
Not according to who?
Merriam-Webster.
Merriam-Webster?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Merriam-Webster.
Okay. All right. So let's go. The last opinion which we get here, this is a great opinion, is Amar Rav, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov Omer Harezem Magosh. This person is a Magosh. What's a Magosh?
Sorcerer.
Somebody mentioned who mentioned this the last time we were here? I think Magi or something, right? These were priests.
The gift of the Magi.
Right. These were priests. Right. These were right. These were the priests. Some say the Zoroastrian priests. The Gemara refers to them as magicians. Rashi says they're people who deceive you into thinking something. Right, the magicians, that ochzei einayim. What does ochzei einayim mean? They trick your eyes. What does a magician do? Magician tricks your eyes, right? Right. You're looking over here, whatever. That's what a magician does. Creates an optical illusion, if you will, right? So that's the worst. Right? That's the lowest of the lows here. Right? Why is a magosh the lowest of the lows? Right? Why is a magosh the lowest of the lows?
You can't trust anything they do.
Correct. Exactly right. In other words, there's no this guy.
They don't mean like literally a sorcerer, because I think
So,
that's
right.
prohibited, right?
Right. So sorcery is prohibited, and the interesting question whether this is referring to somebody who's practicing sorcery or not. Maybe they're putting him on that level of practicing sorcery or not. We're going to see in a minute, that seems to be some connection to saying incantations and practicing some kind of sorcery, some kind of witchcraft, some kind of sorcery. Now, just as a matter of principle, it's important for us to state that we do believe that such a power exists in the world. Right? We might not be able to harness that power anymore, but there were people who could harness that power. The Torah only prohibits things that are within the realm of the possible, right? In other words, the Torah doesn't prohibit you from doing something that you couldn't humanly do. That's something not possible to do. Torah doesn't need to prohibit it from you. So if the Torah prohibits sorcery, the reason the Torah prohibits sorcery is for a reason. That is that people used to practice it, that koach, that power, at one point existed in the world. So the magosh is a person who employs this sorcery. I mean, Rashi says it's sort of optical illusions, but other mefarshim say it literally employs this koach of sorcery to deceive people. So you can't trust that can't trust that person at all about anything, because you don't know what that person really is all about. You don't know if that person's telling you something which is true or not true. So that's the lowest of the lows, right? So you have the Am Haaretz, you have the Bor, you have the Kusi, and you have the Magosh, right? Different opinions, right, as to how bad a person who is Karav V'Shana V'Loshimesh Tamidei Chachamim really is. Who do we decide like? So the Gemara says, and we'll conclude with this for tonight. Who do we decide like? Says the Gemara. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak mistabra ki Rav Acha bar Yaakov. So we're going to go with the last opinion, the opinion of Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who say that they're like sorcery. Why are they like sorcerers? It's the Amre Inshi, because we go by a popular expression. What's the popular expression? What do people say? It's on a bumper sticker. Ratin magusha velo yada my amar. Right? These magicians say these incantations, and they don't understand what they're saying. And now, what's the idea? We're not talking about abracadabra, although abracadabra, if you look up abracadabra, right? What abracadabra, where does that come from? Where does that phrase abracadabra come from? It was connected to an incantation, right? That, people who could summon whatever, right, would use, right? They had these incantations, but people, the Magosh didn't understand it. They didn't understand what they were saying, right? They said it, right? They said it. These words had some impact, some effect, right? Created some kind of reality, but they didn't understand what they're saying. So too, we say the same thing applies to our case. So too, Tani Tana v'lo yada my amar. This guy who is Kara v'Shana v'lo shimesh tamidei chachamim, he can teach a Mishnah, but he has no idea what he's saying. In other words, he knows the words. He can say the words. But he can't explain them. He doesn't understand what he's doing. And that's the same thing by the sorcerer. The sorcerer says the incantation, but has no idea what that incantation means. So these are, the Gemara's laudatory comments about a person who is kara v'shana v'lo shimesh talmidei chachamim. Okay, we'll stop here for today. Everyone, thank you very much. Next week in person at the shul at 8:30. And on Zoom, we'll be back. We'll hope, Mir Hashem, see you next week. Ed, how is California?
You tell me, you tell me to get the score.